Okay, let's begin with a quick prayer of thanksgiving for the inspiration that God gave the doctors and for the ability to produce the vaccine and for the chance to possibly get back to something near normal in the very near future. We thank the Lord in the name of Jesus, his Son. Amen. Okay, we were talking about Pius IX last time, and one of the major things he wanted to do was to strengthen devotion to the Eucharist, but he actually carried this on to all devotions. His personal devotion was to the Virgin Mary, but he really encouraged devotions in the church. It's if you watch the church historically, we go through cycles of a lot of devotion, and then we go through cycles of a lot of scholarship. Then a lot of devotion, a lot of scholarship. And good scholarship should lead to devotion. So, I mean, that's sort of a natural thing. And there was a lot of scholarship going on around this time. One of the things in theology that are very difficult to deal with, we know in the Catholic Church that when you go up to receive communion, you receive the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And we also know at the offertory, what is brought up is bread and wine. How the bread and wine changes to the body and blood of Christ, or exactly the moment it occurs, is unknown. And theologians discuss it a lot. So there had been a lot of discussion about the Eucharist around this time. So it'd be natural that he would want to see devotion as well as the scholarship with it. Leo XIII did much to encourage devotions as well. He dedicated October to the Rosary, and the practice of the Family Rosary began to develop. When I was a youngster, that was a huge thing that parishes encouraged, that the family should get together in the evening and say the Rosary together. And our family tried it for a while. It really didn't work. We would do it on occasions. But there were some families where that became a central devotion. Every night they would gather together and say the Rosary. I have a sneaking suspicion it all ended when TV was developed. But initially it was kind of going on. And he cautioned against allowing a devotion to dominate a person's spirituality. The idea of having, let's say a devotion to Our Lady of Fatima that was huge at that time. When I was a youngster, it was a huge devotion because of the prophecies concerning Russia and the great fear we had of Russia at the time. But there were people, their whole spirituality was this devotion to Our Lady of Fatima. And I think so strongly at times people didn't even know that she was the Virgin Mary, that they would just see this Lady of Fatima. And so in our tradition, we have our first devotion really is the worship of Jesus Christ. That is the first devotion. And beside that, like if I were looking at my life, my principal devotion is sacred scripture. But there are people who have a devotion to one thing or another. I should mention my devotion to St. Anthony is increasing with the speed at which I lose things right now. But I think it has to do with what a person wants. But your spirituality shouldn't be focused on a single devotion. Okay, it can be focused on Jesus, but it can't be focused on a devotion. Near the end of the 19th century, both public and private devotion to the Eucharist really grew. So the devotion began to increase. And I remember that when I was a youngster, we used to have 40 hours devotion that was an exposition of the Holy Eucharist over a 40-hour period. And there were always people in the church for it for the entire 40 hours. We also had processions. We had one on the Feast of Corpus Christi and one on the end of the 40-hour devotion, in which we would march in a procession around the area carrying the Eucharist and go back to the church. And the other thing is this was a time when Catholics were encouraged to spend time just in silence before the Blessed Sacrament. Again, when I was a youngster, you never entered a Catholic church and found it empty. Never. Now, you hardly ever find Mission San Luis Obispo empty because there are tourists and stuff going through. But it used to be that at every church you'd find someone, people would go in, and like if I was going, our house was on the edge of the downtown area to Pacific Beach. But if I passed the church, I always went in and said a prayer, and that's just common practice, this idea of the Blessed Sacrament. When Fulton Sheen was teaching, one of the principal things he would do when he was talking to priests was ask them to spend 1 hour a day in silence in presence of the Blessed Sacrament. It became a big devotion for many priests. I think it may still be, but the idea of just spending an hour in silence in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And this is also the time when Eucharistic congresses were started. I think every so many years there's a Eucharistic Congress, and people from all over the world come. There are great teachings about the Eucharist at these things, and devotions and processions and stuff, but all wrapped around the Eucharist. I think one of the things that happens with regards to devotions is the type of devotion a person has can be very, very powerful in their spirituality. And I would say that about myself, that my devotion to the Scriptures, that I tend to look for inspiration from the Scriptures. I tend to look for leadership and wisdom and guidance in my life and everything. I do all of that scripturally. It becomes a very powerful thing in my life. But I have to be very careful I never reach a point where I think someone who doesn't have a devotion to the Scripture isn't Catholic. And that's very easy if your whole focus is the Rosary to think, well, how could a person not have a devotion to the Rosary and actually be Catholic? How could a person not have this devotion? And I think, again, devotions are not the heart of our faith, but they are a sign of the growth of faith. I would say that religion without devotion isn't really religion. Religion has to come to devotion in some kind. But it's kind of like a rose bush. A rose bush must produce roses, okay? But the important thing is the bush, not the roses. Piety and spirituality were growing at this time also in the Protestant community. And many of the denominations grew rapidly. There was a huge growth in missionary work, as well as a flowering of social work among the poor. Because the Protestant churches were relatively young at this time, they had spent their early days very defensively proving why they weren't Catholic or why they got out of the Catholic Church. So that sort of occupied them very, very heavily for a long time. And at this point, they began to come out of that. That's no longer the issue. They don't have to prove they're Protestant. They are Protestant. So now they began to grow in spirituality. There were many denominations that began like missionary work in their own countries and that sort of thing. And we see a great growth, and again, a flowering of social work. The 19th century marked the popularity of the novel, and the art form grew in importance and influence on society. Now, when the development of printing came out, printing was largely concentrated on textbooks and information, things we wanted to keep and all that sort of thing. But about this time, the 19th century, the art form that we know as the novel has existed from ancient times. It's just that in ancient times they were given auricularly, and so stories were passed that way. But now they began to develop in the novel, and the printing presses were able to deal with that and spread it around, and the reading of novels became a big thing at the time. The novels, it'd be a very interesting thing. You can look at certain novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin that had a huge influence on motivating people to the Civil War in the United States. But novels have become very, very important. And this was just kind of the beginning of it. They began to look at society, novelists, in a new way as a source of stories, not only to entertain, but also to make people aware of the lives of other people. This will reach a high point probably about 100 years after here, where people will go off to different lands and study people, and then come back and do lecture tours and would talk about peoples in different lands. People were very, very curious. And I think a lot of that was fueled by Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, in which he had a certain, let's say, attitude to Native Americans. And he put this on as a show, and people would go in and feel they came out understanding Native Americans. I think one of the curious things is to be in a country like Italy. And if you say the word Italian cooking in Italy, they have no idea what you're talking about, because Italian food in Sicily is very different from Italian food in southern Italy, which is radically different from northern Italy. And so the food's but in the United States, we can talk about an Italian restaurant and this sort of thing, and we know basically what they serve. Well, the same thing was true at this time with regards to people. You had in your mind, this is the English, without realizing there's royalty, there's servants, there's Cockney, there's, all these different areas in England. And so the novelists began to show the variety and stuff by taking a particular life, and oftentimes they dealt away from royalty. People wrote about royalty all the time because royalty were flattered by it and would finance it. But now they began to write these novels that were really giving an insight into people's lives. Royal people were still a part of the stories, but the poor and middle class were treated in sympathetic manner, and the royalty were largely around the edges of it. They would mention them one way or another. In England, Dickens began to write, and he told stories in a new and very difficult industrial society. People's lives changed dramatically with the growth of industrial society, and that was what Dickens wrote about. Balzac did the same thing in France with the middle class and their efforts to deal with the changes that were going on. Slowly, Christians came to understand and realize the authentic stories of common people offered much food for thought about what society really demanded of religious people. See, the society was so stratified. One of the things you discover in the mixing of society is people are always most comfortable with their own class. So if you have a very poor person, they are uncomfortable being around very rich people because they ain't dressed like them and that sort of thing. But simultaneously, rich people are very uncomfortable around poor people because they don't know how to deal with them and talk to them. But society is divided up that way. And I think when I was a youngster, it was very divided up that way religiously. So the Catholics tended to associate with themselves and Baptists with themselves and that sort of thing. And we were sort of uncomfortable being with one another. Not that we disliked one another or were angry or anything, but there wasn't a comfort level. And so now people began to notice a lot about other areas of society. So they would realize people were poor, but they didn't realize how devastating the poverty was. And they would realize people are very wealthy and didn't realize the problems contained with wealth. But the books made people aware of this sort of thing. There were attempts to view the Bible in terms of fiction and its techniques. And these were attempts to relate the gospel narratives to everyday life today. the they would take the Bible and deal with the Bible as a collection just of stories, okay? And you can deal with the Bible that way, but the key thing for a religious person is, what are the stories teaching us, what are they telling us, and how do they form us? But at this time, a lot of people, were just beginning to read, and so they introduced them to these stories that came from the Bible. And I think many of us would understand that from when we were taking catechism. When I was in catechism, the nuns wouldn't read the story of Genesis to us. They would tell us the story of God's creating all these things. And that's what was going on at this time. They would turn these into stories. The problem is that a lot of people at the time then began to think of them as fiction. And the attempts to relate the gospel to narratives of everyday life are kind of common. There's a really interesting play that came out when I was in college called Job, J-O-B. And if you look at the book of Job in the Bible, you'll notice that it is a play, and these passages are assigned to individuals. And so they put it on as a play, you would see. And it was nothing but the Bible text. I think it came from the King James. But it was nothing but the Bible text recited by these different characters. A very fascinating way of doing it. But there's always ongoing efforts to get people somehow interested in the Bible. This turn to realism then became evident in painting. Monet is a good example of what's going on. Painters would go outside in the sunshine to paint. Now, if you look at Monet, a lot of his paintings are very ethereal, but that tends to be the way we see things when we're outside. The painters, oftentimes before this, if they were going to do a pastoral scene, they would do it entirely from their mind in the studio. Another way to do it would be to go outside and basically draw it and then come in and paint it. But it's very different if you have a tree. I'll just use a tree. We have a tree here, and we're doing a painting of the tree. And I decide I'm going out, let's say at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I am going to work on and paint this tree. Now, most people don't turn out a painting in 2 hours or something. So as you're sitting there working, do you realize the light is changing? The shadows are changing. You may even have birds come into the tree or leave the tree or this sort of thing. So as you're doing this, things are changing. And so that greatly affected painting. And that would lead ultimately to some of the very dramatic things that Picasso would do. Picasso, oftentimes when painting a person, would change the lighting. So the lighting on your nose would not be the lighting on your eye. It's because the light was different when he painted your eye. But this came from painting outside. They started to paint outside and they became moralistic. This kind of painting came to be called Impressionism. And the reason it's called Impressionism is they are doing the painting to create the impression on you that the scene creates on them. Much more than to get the scene, you want to get the emotion and the impression of the whole thing. Some have said that Illuminists would have been a better term because they were all interested in the play of light on their subject. So people had wanted to call them Illuminists, and I think Illuminist has a much more scholastic meaning than art. But the interesting thing about them is they were fascinated with the way light played and stuff like that. You find a lot of that in Rembrandt and Van Gogh. There was official resistance to this new form of art. Now, what do I mean by official resistance? Official resistance would be that if I owned a gallery, I wouldn't hang that kind of art. And until you can get your art hung in a gallery, you can't make money off it. You have to be able to, like, they did not have, at this time in history, what you and I would know as like an art show on the street where different people would show their art at different places. They didn't have that sort of stuff. And painting was very, very expensive. You have to stretch the canvas, you have to buy the oils. If you take an oil painting, you may work 2 months on an oil painting. And then if you can't get anything for it, I mean, that's 2 months gone. So the resistance to this form of art, but the new way of looking at reality made the world look less solid and real, with the result that people began to call into question their old beliefs and habits, okay? So this Impressionism caused people to look at things in a new way. And when they began to look in a new way, then they began to look back and reflect on their lives in a new way. Someone gave me an older Far Side cartoon, and it shows a woman at the clothes dryer in her house. It's a square clothes dryer, and she's just laying on top of it. And it says in the thing under the caption is, Mildred is suddenly struck by the identification between the cycles in her dryer and her life. And that's what went on. People began to look at their lives as being rather boring. You know, like, I view my life in a set way, but that isn't what happens there. The tree changes during the day as time goes on. It'll never be the same twice. And so they begin to look at everything very differently and looked at old habits and old beliefs and began to challenge them. This process of questioning, I should point out, continues right up to our own time. And I think one of the difficulties in today's world is that young people are most involved in this. And as we get older, we think we've answered a number of things as we get older. And it bothers us when people are still questioning what we've answered for ourselves. And so that's a difficulty, but to always remember that this idea of the questioning is where we come to the fullness. I think one of the key things in all of this is to realize that we're not really the end of the process, okay? There's a whole process that's going on. It's been going on ever since the beginning. And the interesting thing is it's becoming more and more rapid, okay? I think at the beginning, people didn't even notice change was going on while it was. Now, in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church never entered very deeply into the lives of the people. Russian novelists, however, wrote much about what part Christians played in the lives of everyday Russians. I would say that religious literature in Russia was more novels than it was religious books, okay? They had some devotional books, but they didn't have theology books like we do. They didn't have the studies of different points and everything of theology. There was the monks and everything studied deep theology, but in popular people, the real insight into the Russian religion was these novels. And to talk about a couple of them, Tolstoy. Tolstoy was deeply religious, and he called for great change both in the Russian Orthodox Church and in the Russian state. The Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state have always been very closely identified. And that's why the church literally collapsed when the end of the czars, because they were identified with that. Now, if you notice today, the Russian Orthodox Church is becoming much more identified with Putin. And we will see whether they're identified with, premiers from now on. But Putin has rebuilt some of the major churches that were torn down over a period of time. And in fact, I saw him on TV about a month ago at the dedication of a new Russian cathedral built just for the military. But that you see that in Russia, the church is very tied in to the government. And if you are tied into the government, you don't think in terms of a lot of social challenge, because the government is the stable thing. So he attempted to live a new kind of life among peasants. So Tolstoy moved out of the society. Writers, everything were in the upper society, and moved out of that and went to live among peasants. One advantage of that, it gave him a lot of material for his writing, and he did that. He wanted to live a nonviolent life of simplicity, and he rejected absolutely any organization of any kind that used force of any kind. So he rejected that. And when you study a little bit about Tolstoy, I don't know whether he would like it if I were to say this, but I think he's essentially the first hippie. He really seems to embody kind of what the hippies were about. Dostoevsky turned away from his own liberal Western ideas to trust the Christian message and the mission of the Russian Orthodox Church. So he was very, very liberal and very Western, Dostoevsky. But what he did was began to look at the message of Jesus and began to see this as the mission of the Russian Orthodox Church, to present the message of Jesus to the community, not just to stabilize the community, which is what they largely were doing. His book stressed sin and repentance and the possibility of living a truly Christ-like life. I think people who have read his books, he always talks about repentance. He always talks about real people. He talks about how a real person with the real difficulties, the real problems we all have, can come to great holiness. He's very, very good at that. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is a modern author in Russia who stresses the same spiritual principles. This period also saw a revival of spiritual life among the monastic communities. Lots of monks in Russia. The monks became known for their wisdom and their holiness, okay? Now, the wisdom and the holiness of the monks has been kind of traditional in Russia, but sometimes they're kind of public with it, and oftentimes they're kind of private with it. Here they became more public with it, but never think of the monks in terms of the Russian Orthodox Church. Like in the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, here at the mission, we have diocesan priests. But it isn't unusual at all for them to have a monk come in and say masses, or for a monk to give a mission or something like that. The monastic life in the Latin Church is integrated and is supposed to be at the service of the whole Christian community. They aren't supposed to be so isolated that they don't really benefit the community itself. But in Russia, they're very separate between the Orthodox Church and the monastic life. In 1861, Russia is a huge country, as you know, with its own striking features at every level. The serfs at this time were in fact slaves. They could not own land, and they could not leave the landlord's land. So if you were a serf working on this particular land here, and the land were sold to someone else, you'd become the serf for someone else. It just, you went with the land. You belonged to the land. Alexander II freed the serfs, but they had to pay certain taxes and were still bound to their land, okay? So they technically were free, but the only thing they got out of it was they were required to pay taxes. They were still bound to their land. The actions of the students in the universities reflected the unrest in Russia, with protests, strikes, and violence, which became a normal part of Russian life. And these were answered with arrests and deportations. Those of you who maybe saw the movie Evita, you would remember at the beginning of the movie, as Perón was rising to power, there were these riots by the students. They'd be put down by the police or the army, and this went back and forth. And then Perón became a very strong power in the country. But you notice near the end of the movie, the same thing comes up again. This time they're reacting against Perón. But the whole thing, and this was very much a part of the life in Russia. Anywhere you were, you would expect to see student riots. You would expect to see the police and the army put it down, and certain people deported. Most of the people considered the Tsar a divinely appointed father. He was a parent to all the people. So the Tsar was kind of immune from this stuff going on, although the Tsar was really responsible. But the government began to spy on people and create reports on the activities of people. When governments find a society turning against them, they become extremely paranoid historically. And the way they see this paranoia, they see there are certain leaders that are leading society, and they're leading society against the government. And if we could just get rid of these leaders, then that would disappear. So they began to spy on the people and send spies into the people to find out who the real leaders are. And I think what people don't understand at this point is if you have a movement, I'll take the most recent one, Black Lives Matter. If you identify the people who are really in charge of it and get rid of them, other people will be in charge of it. The fact of the matter is, the movement's in the heart of people, and they're behind a leader because he or she will galvanize them together. But it's not the leader that's making the movement. It's the people that are making the movement. Some Russians supported the Tsar, but wanted a constitutional government, something like England would have, where the Tsar would be ceremonial and all that sort of thing. Some wanted a new form of government, universal voting rights, and a completely parliamentary form of government. And this is more what we find in England. It's completely parliamentary. I think of the yearly message of the Queen to the country. It's called the message before the crown or something like that. But that speech is actually written by the Prime Minister. The Queen isn't allowed to write that own speech. It's written by the Prime Minister. And she reads it. It's what the government's going to be doing and everything. And so in England, the royal family is supposed to be non-political, okay? It's supposed to be like a symbol of union in the country. I think an example of that, we saw that in the United States. Those of you who remember when Reagan was president, Reagan was like everybody's parent. And he sort of held that. And the reins of government were really in other people he appointed. But he really functioned as sort of our father. And that's why people were really upset that, for instance, he is the one who sold arms to the Contras in South America and all that sort of stuff, and was involved in all kinds of shady deals like that. And he never got in any kind of trouble at all. And that's because we didn't consider him part of it. They called him the Teflon president, but he was just independent of all that. And so some people, however, very few, but some traditionalists supported the Tsar and his absolute rule. The Tsar in Russia ruled absolutely. Everything came, yes from him was yes, no from him was no. There was no one who contradicted him, no way to go around it or anything. So it was an absolute rule. In 1898, the Socialist Democratic Party was formed, and within it was the Bolsheviks. They were part of this. The Bolsheviks were advocating the communist ideas of Karl Marx. And so his ideas were being manifested in the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks were just one part of this Socialist Democratic Party. The Bolsheviks were led by Lenin, believing that the overthrow of capitalism would bring about a classless society. He trained people to use violence and force to terrorize the capitalists. It's very interesting to read things like about Lenin. He believed that communism would bring a classless society, and we know that's really not true. But he wanted to see a society in which there were no classes. There were the thing that has the best chance of bringing about that is democratic socialism. And you find that in Denmark and Sweden and Finland and those countries. You really have a largely classless society. And taxes are high enough that no one can get really wealthy. And yet the taxes supply basically the needs of the people. And so you have medical, you have retirement, all this sort of thing. But it forms a rather classless society. And the attempt to do that with communism did not work. I think if you were to look at the foundation of our country under George Washington, he was aiming at a classless society through a republic, which we are. But that hasn't produced a classless society either. The thing that was going on here, they're very interesting things when you study Lenin. One of the things he maintained, he says, if you can bring enough chaos in society, people will accept any government in order to have order. So he says, if you can get the place upset bad enough, they will accept, and that's what he did in Russia. He got them so upset that they would accept communism, just something had to hold the country together. And Hitler used a lot of that in Germany as well. As European explorers moved more and more into the interior of Africa, nations began to compete for shares of the continent. What happened in Africa is exactly what would happen to the Native Americans. That the European nations looked on Africa as an open area, and they could take pieces and do anything they wanted with it because they were civilizing the people, okay? So the same thing would happen in North and South America with the Native Americans. But they began to compete at this time. Leopold II of Belgium set up an international African association to fight the slave trade and encourage and protect Christian missionaries, okay? So he wanted Christian missionaries to go into the country, and he wanted them protected. And so in order to do that, of course, he wanted to have soldiers take care of them and this sort of thing, much like the Spanish here in California. And simultaneously, the big thing he did, though, was to try and abolish the slave trade, to begin to put an end to it. Through agreements with various chiefs, he created the independent state of the Congo, which was recognized by other colonial powers and then proved to be very, very profitable for Belgium. And the reason is that they had a lot of very cheap labor. They did not take them as slaves into Belgium, but they had the stuff produced, much like we have a lot of very inexpensive stuff produced in China for us. The Chinese aren't our slaves. We don't have anything to do with that. But they produce all kinds of things that are much cheaper than other places, and we bring them into our place that way. Germany called a Berlin conference and laid down rules for the takeover of the African territory. So now Germany calls this conference and lays down the rules by which Africa will simply be cut up. Most all of Africa was then under the control of one or another European country, and it was never for the benefit of the Africans, okay? Now, I think a lot of people went in there for good ideas, much like many people came to North and South America with many good ideas about the natives, but it did not turn out to be for the benefit of the natives at all. The takeover of the lands was not actually a peaceful affair there any more than it was here. The Africans were no match for the European armies and weapons. Native Americans, no match for the European armies and weapons. And so it all went on. Now, Charles Lavegere, I think, became the Archbishop of Algiers, a territory included Tunisia and the Sahara, and it was under the control of France, okay? So he was made Archbishop in Algiers. He founded a religious order, very powerful order today, called the White Fathers, and they in turn founded the White Sisters. They were named, their habits were white. And if you go into Algeria, you'll notice the people wear white. They have these white caftans type things. And so he took what they were wearing. These missionaries were to build schools and orphanages. Now again, he's sending his missionaries in. His missionaries are not there to make converts. They're to build schools and orphanages. They're basically to go in to live the Christian life. He worked tirelessly against the slave trade. He wanted to build a native church with African priests and African bishops. He wanted to get a native church going. He worked in Europe to teach an understanding of the African mind and culture. They went through churches. When I was a youngster, we used to have the White Fathers come in once a year, mainly to raise money for their missions, I think in Morocco at the time. At the end of the 19th century, there were 2.5 million Catholics in Africa. Okay, at the end of the 19th century, 2.5 million Catholics, and very largely due to this gentleman. He worked well with the people, independently of the powers who were bringing in these things. Samuel Crawler was the first native African bishop of the Anglican Church, and Edward Blyden, a Presbyterian minister. They were also clergy, had great effect and respect for the African people, and they greatly built their respective churches. So there were individuals coming in for these churches that worked independent. Like I look at California, it's too bad that Father Serra was never allowed to be independent of the Spanish government. He tried to several times, but he really was incapable of it. In 1886, we have a gentleman who's very, very important to me personally. He's a man called Charles de Foucauld, and he had a very colorful early life. His family was wealthy, and he was a constant embarrassment to them because of the antics he would go on and the life he was leading. So they forced him into the French Foreign Legion, serving in Morocco. And the way they were able to do this is that he got money from the family, because it was a wealthy family, and they cut off the money unless he joined the French Foreign Legion. So he did. And while he was serving in Morocco, he conceived actually a great love for the local people there. And what he did then was, after he ceased to be a member of the Foreign Legion, somehow among the people, it's hard to explain how this happened. You can see it in his books, but he was so impressed by the devotional life of Muslims, that they would pray at their set times of the day and stuff, that this forced him to look anew at his Catholicism and to make his Catholicism as vibrant a part of his life as he found the Muslim faith among the peasants in Morocco. And so he decided to become a Trappist monk and experienced his very call to conversion. And he felt that he was to try and convert the tribes that he had known in the desert. And I want you to know that the French government was very anxious to see Charles de Foucauld go back into in the desert of Morocco. He was one of the most highly respected men in the world at the time with reference to Morocco because of a specific thing. He so loved the country, he traveled everywhere and he drew maps. And Charles de Foucault's maps were the maps of Morocco that were used up until they could take pictures from planes and do maps. His were very accurate maps. He became famous for that. Charles moved into the Moroccan desert and lived in a small hut that he constructed. He just constructed a hut out of reeds and things. He had a great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. Remember, we come out of this devotion to the sacrament. So he kept the Blessed Sacrament in his hut, and he would spend his time in front of the Blessed Sacrament praying and in service to the people he lived among. He would help them with different things, a harvest, whatever they needed, he would help them. He wanted to found a religious order to carry on his style of Catholic witness. He thought this would have the best chance of converting the people, and he really wanted to sort of start an order. And Charles was murdered in 1916 without ever having made a single convert and without having been able to persuade any other people to join him in his work. At this time, a priest could not celebrate Mass unless there was another person present who had some connection with the church. And so there was a very young man who Charles de Foucauld was giving instructions to. And so he called him a catechumen. And therefore, that young man being there gave Charles the permission to celebrate the liturgy. That young man never became a Catholic. So there was never a convert and everything. And he was well liked by the people, but there were some people jealous of him. And again, he did not preach Catholicism or anything. He was living this life. The rule he wrote for his planned religious community became the order called the Little Brothers of Jesus, and in 1932, and the Little Sisters of Jesus in 1939. And they live in communities around the world. They live a life of poverty, serving the people around them that way. But perhaps his most important legacy is the Jesu Caritas movement among the diocesan clergy in the Catholic Church. I'm a member of this. It gathers small communities of priests to support one another in their service, because today very few rectories have many priests in them. So a priest's life, a diocesan priest's life today can be very much alone. And his rule was written for Catholics living in a non and often anti-Catholic environment. So it was ideal for priests living alone. And also, his rule has greatly influenced every religious rule written since, because today we all live in a society that really is minimally non-Catholic and oftentimes anti-Catholic. So why don't we stop it there, and we'll continue on a little more about Africa next time. Thank you very much.